Disclaimer: this video is for educational and entertainment purposes only. This video may contain strong language, mention of different kinds of abuse and/or gore. Viewer discretion is advised. Good evening, guys, ghouls, and girls. Welcome to the 6th episode of Spook Chatter, where we cover someone a little less in the media and spotlight, but still just as messed up. This episode's topic is based on Carroll Eddie Cole. That's right, who, I hear you ask? Well, strap yourselves in for quite the messed up individual. His first murder performed at the ripe age of 8 years old, with a sprinkle of mental health issues and a rough childhood, you just know you're in for a bumpy ride with this one. Carroll Cole was born on the 9th of May 1938 in Sioux City, Iowa, United States. He died by execution of lethal injection at the age of 47 on the 6th of December 1985 in Nevada State Prison. He was convicted of 3 murders in Texas and pleaded guilty to 2 murders in Nevada. While he was only convicted for 5 victims, he confessed to up to a total of 13 murders, but is believed to have murdered dozens between the years 1947 and 1980, even claiming up to 35 victims. Carroll Edward Cole was born to Laverne and Vesta Cole as the second son after the eldest, Richard, with a sister born the following year of Carroll's birth in 1939. The family had moved to Richmond, California, where Laverne had started working in a shipyard to then shortly be drafted to serve in World War II. At just 5 years of age, whilst his father was away, his mother would play by engaging in several affairs with different men, sometimes even forcing Carroll to witness these horrendous acts as she entertained them. On top of this already traumatic behaviour, and for her own entertainment purposes, his mother would also force Carroll to parade around in frilly skirts and petticoats, holding little gatherings with her friends to laugh and ridicule Cole, calling him names like Mama's little girl. If that wasn't enough, Vesta would often beat, whip, and threaten Carroll into silence to ensure that he wouldn't speak a word of her transgressions to his father upon his return. These atrocious acts performed by his mother only fueled a fire of hatred for women inside Carroll. If that wasn't enough for a young boy to have to deal with, Carroll was enrolled in elementary school 2 years behind his peers, and he was also bullied at school for having a sissy girl's name. Carroll resorted to using his middle name Eddie, which was short for Edward. At the age of 7, Carroll's father Laverne returned home, and the beatings from his mother had ceased. However, this is arguably where the issues began, as he had started fantasizing about murdering his mother and just random females that crossed his path. Eddie had also experienced a blackout rage, where upon coming to had found that he had strangled the family's puppy, which he later explained was a result of the relentless bullying he endured at school for his feminine name. In 1946, Carroll's first murder had occurred. He was a mere 8 years old, swimming at Richmond's Yacht Harbour with a group of schoolboys, where he had held the head of Dwayne Eugene Owen under water until the 8-year-old boy lost consciousness and eventually drowned and died at the hands of Carroll. Dwayne's death was deemed an accident by authorities at the time, until many years later, when Carroll was convicted and he wrote an autobiography confessing to the murder, as Dwayne was one of the peers that had given him a hard time for his name. During a press interview, Carroll said of this event, "I was primed. I had made the mental commitment I was going to get even with my mother, and things just built up and became an obsession." After his first taste for blood, he proceeded to start fights with other kids at his school, and even crushed the hand of the winner of a yo-yo contest after they had won against Carroll. How had he managed to do this, I hear you ask? Well, kids will be kids, and Eddie had managed to engage the gears of a bulldozer that they were playing around with, and crushed his rival's hand inside the massive treads. It is unclear if he was ever punished appropriately for this, or if it too was deemed an accident. Carroll didn't apply himself too much in his teenage years. While his IQ was ranking high at a score of 152, his grades were averaging a D+ at best. This was likely due to the physical and psychological abuse he suffered in his earlier years, and then also the neglect that followed by his mother. By 14, Carroll was committing several petty crimes such as burglarizing liquor stores and arson before eventually being arrested for minor thefts and drunkenness, resulting in him dropping out of his junior year at school. In February 1957, Carroll had joined the Navy, but this career path was short-lived as he had been caught attempting to steal government-owned weapons, landing him in the military brig and being discharged with bad conduct. Upon returning home with his family and working a few odd jobs over a few years, this wasn't quite fulfilling his sick urges, so he proceeded to attack two couples parked in their cars on Lovers Lane with a hammer in 1960 when he was just 22 years of age. After his conviction of assault with a deadly weapon, he was sentenced to 30 days on the county work farm. The following year, he had found himself in and out of prison from his petty crimes and also psychiatric facilities after flagging down a police officer and admitting to urges he has to physically and sexually assault women. He had committed himself to Napa State Hospital under the advice of the police officer and stayed there for 90 days for observation and treatment, however, refused to share his difficult upbringing and abuse he had endured. A diagnosis of antisocial sociopath personality disturbance was made by the doctors of the Napa State Hospital, recommending that he be discharged, but suggested that he start outside psychiatric treatment or voluntarily admit himself to a Atascadero State Hospital to assist with his sadistic, abnormal sexual tendencies. Once released from Napa State Hospital, Carroll served his 6-month sentence for the auto theft crimes he had committed prior to Napa State and requested for psychiatric help, where he was then sent to Atascadero State Hospital for help by Dr. Irwin Hart. After a couple of months, Dr. Hart had diagnosed him as a passive, dependent person with a facade of independence and confusion concerning sexual identification. Carroll was then transferred over to Stockton State Hospital, where Dr. Weiss had determined Carroll was afraid of the female figure and cannot have intercourse with her first, but must kill her before doing so. Dr. Weiss diagnosed this condition as a schizophrenic reaction of the chronic undifferentiated type, while hospital staff had diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder. Despite these diagnoses, and being deemed quite dangerous and unpredictable, Weiss approved the release of Carroll on the 19th of April 1963 with an indefinite leave of absence to self, whatever that even means. Carroll would move to Dallas, Texas, where his brother Richard resided. Richard would dedicate a few weeks showing Carroll around in attempts to keep his brother out of further trouble. However, in July 1963, Carroll would still proceed to attempt to strangle a woman to death. Luckily, he was unsuccessful with killing her, and as a result of failing this, he would attempt to commit suicide by swallowing some pills which landed him in a psychiatric ward for 4 days. Many months later, he would meet and marry a stripper by the name of Neville Billy Whitworth, who had struggled with alcoholism. The marriage would only last for a total of 2 years, as Carroll had convinced himself that Billy was cheating on him. This sent him into his normal pattern of uncontrollable rage, landing him in prison for arson as he had burned down a motel that he believed Billy was using for her infidelity. Carroll was released in January 1967, and he began just drifting, ending up in Oklahoma and then eventually ending up in Missouri, where he would proceed to break into an 11-year-old girl's bedroom and attempted to murder her by strangulation as she slept. Thankfully, he was unsuccessful in killing the girl and pled guilty to a reduced charge, receiving only 5 years in prison. He was released on parole, managing to make his way back to Reno, Nevada, where he would attempt to strangle 2 women at 2 separate locations while bar hopping. He would surrender to Reno police, where he would confess his sick, twisted urges to murder women. Carroll would be charged with disorderly conduct and eventually be committed to a state hospital at Sparks, Nevada in September 1970. A doctor by the name of Felix Peebles diagnosed him with compulsion to strangle and rape attractive women, alcoholism, with an antisocial personality, but would retract this diagnosis, saying that Carroll, quote, was a highly manipulative man who was utilizing his difficulties with the law and his threats of violence in order to acquire shelter when he is out of funds. He was discharged and would be sent off home to San Diego. This is where Carroll's violence towards women would be turned up a notch. On the 7th of May 1971, Carroll managed to fulfill his sick, twisted fantasy by successfully strangling a 39-year-old woman, Essie Buck, to death and leaving her body in the boot of his car overnight. A couple of days later, on his 33rd birthday, he dumped her body and kept quiet for a couple of weeks before murdering another woman by strangulation. Unfortunately, her remains are still undiscovered somewhere outside of San Isidro, and we only know this victim by the name of Wilma. According to my sources, there was a third victim, also murdered by strangulation not long after Wilma. However, they also remain unknown. In June 1971, Carroll would serve time for drunk driving and theft, being released the following March. Carroll would drive to San Isidro and pick up 2 unknown women, killing one with a hammer and other by strangulation. Both of their bodies were buried in the desert and remain undiscovered. When asked why he targeted these women when finally caught, Carroll would claim that they had proven themselves unfaithful to their husbands and so reminded him of his adulterous mother. In 1972, Carroll would go on to meet and shortly after move in with a woman named Diana Paschal. She was a barmaid that, despite not having a monogamous relationship with Carroll, would proceed to marry him in July 1973. Diana would also have her own issues with drinking, and the two would fight and argue frequently, resulting in Carroll leaving for a couple of days at a time. The two would move from San Diego to Las Vegas, where Carroll would land a job transporting coins from a local airport to the local casinos, but, as we know, he has no self-control, so why would this be any different? Of course, he would steal an entire shipment of coins and flee to Wyoming, leaving his wife back in Las Vegas. Carroll would meet Merlene Hamer in early August of 1975. Merlene, nicknamed TP for her Native American roots, would drink, dance, and party with Carroll. Even though Merlene would wear a wedding ring, she would proceed to ask Carroll if he would like to spend the night with her, only to be strangled with her body left on a hillside just outside of Casper, Wyoming, covered by an old sleeping bag. Once Merlene's remains were discovered by authorities on the 9th of August, Carroll would flee the state the next day, heading back to San Diego. Carroll would go to check himself into a detoxification center after one of his drunken benders. The length of stay is a little difficult to find. However, he did cause himself some strife because as he was leaving the centre, he had stolen a $1,500 government cheque from another patient at the centre and had attempted to cash it in for himself. Carroll, of course, was charged in June 1976 with mail theft and would jump bail, but was caught shortly after and charged with unlawful flight. Both of these convictions would land Carroll in prison for a year in February 1977. He was paroled in April, becoming a federal fugitive as he fled back to Las Vegas. While he was hot off the press, just a month after his release from prison, he would strangle a 26-year-old Kathleen Bloom during or after doing the deed and would leave her body in a stranger's backyard. Police would recover her body on the 14th of May 1977. An autopsy would confirm her cause of death was manual strangulation. Detectives didn't have any valid leads on Kathleen's case at the time. As we know by now, Carroll was always doing side quests, and this was no different, for on the 19th of July 1977 in North Las Vegas, Carroll would find himself jailed again for a car theft. He made bail and would skip his court date scheduled for September, making his way to Oklahoma City. The night before Thanksgiving in the very same year, Carroll would end up at a topless bar meeting a woman who would make the fatal mistake of agreeing to spend the night with him. This is where things begin to unfold as we begin to see a different side of Carroll. His MO has always been strangulation. However, with this poor, unfortunate victim, it would seem he also went down the cannibalistic route. He would wake up on the 24th of November at sunrise to find the woman deceased in his bathtub. Her right arm and both of her feet were severed and missing, which he would later discover in his refrigerator. Part of her buttocks was sliced off and placed in a skillet on the stove. Carroll would use kitchen knives and a hacksaw to dismember the rest of the victim's body and place them in plastic garbage bags, where he would take them to the city dump for the body to presumably be burned. Later, Carroll would write about this particular scenario, writing, quote, "Somewhere in the middle of our making love, the booze kicked in, or else my mind went blank. I can't say which." Like that was his way of diffusing his extremely horrendous actions. Carroll would drive from Oklahoma City to Texas and would find work in Denver City. As he couldn't help himself, Carroll would be arrested for public drunkenness, and after a fingerprint check, it would be revealed that he was wanted in California as a federal fugitive from his priors. A week later, he was sent back to San Diego with a 6-month jail sentence with 3 years of probation. This was with the contingencies of participating in an alcoholic rehab program and having full-time employment. His bail jumping charges would be dismissed on Carroll's 40th birthday, freeing him on the 16th of June 1978, where he would reunite with his wife Diana soon after. He would later write about what this experience was like, stating, "We got along fine, but I was sleeping on the couch for several days until she finally invited me into the bedroom." The law-abiding citizen hadn't managed to land a full-time job, jumping from one part-time job to another while still drinking heavily. He eventually ended up being jailed for drunkenness on the 25th of October. Another violation of his probation added to his long list of wrongdoings and released from bail with a $2,000 bond. He was arrested again on the 8th of November, but this information was never passed on to his probation officer. The following year, Carroll managed to get some temporary employment at an appliance store where he would invite his next victim to after meeting her at a local bar. 39-year-old Bonnie Sue O'Neill met Carroll, and he would later recall this encounter as a night to end all screwing, but it would ultimately end Bonnie Sue's life when she mentioned she needed to phone her husband. Carroll would strangle her, leave her body out the back of the appliance store, and dump her clothes in a nearby garbage bin. It was later reported that police on the case never actually questioned Carroll or any of the staff that worked there. Carroll and Diana's toxic marriage would come to a very sudden end when Carroll decided to use his vows of "till death do us part" seriously, when he would strangle and kill his wife on the 17th of September 1979. He wrapped her body up in blankets and shoved her in a closet. Eddie would attempt to dig a grave in the crawl space of his house 8 days later to bury Diana's corpse, but his neighbour, getting some suspicious vibes from this activity, decided to call local authorities. They would drive Carroll to a local detox centre, and by the time he was released the next morning, Diana's mother had found her daughter's remains and police were there at the scene. Carroll would flee the scene and catch a bus to Las Vegas. An autopsy of Diana's body would rule her death as alcohol poisoning, as the results of her blood alcohol level would show she was 4 times over the legal limit. While he wasn't wanted for this crime, his probation officer was chasing him, and a bench warrant would be issued on the 27th of September 1979. This didn't worry Carroll though, as he would continue his life as per normal, picking up a job as a truck driver for a religious charity where he would pick up donations of second-hand items and clothes and deliver it to said charity. While he was working such a wholesome job, his activities outside of that were still horrendous. Carroll's next victim was Marie Cushman, a 50-year-old woman that he would invite to the Casbah Hotel on the 3rd of November 1979, where he would presumably strangle her to death and leave her in the room where the maid would find her the next day. Interestingly, one of the pages I'm referencing for information for this topic, linked below, has stated that an article in the Las Vegas Review-Journal described 2 suspects in Cushman's murder. One was an unidentified 50-year-old man, 5'2" with grey hair. The other, described by a Casbah desk clerk, was an Indian in his 30s, about 6 feet tall with short wavy black hair, driving a Chevrolet with California license plates. Neither bore any resemblance to Cole, and the false leads left police stymied. Carroll would meet his 3rd wife through his job and would marry her on the 16th of December 1979 in Las Vegas, where they would honeymoon in Texas for an extended amount of time. While driving, he was stopped by police for driving without a valid license, which usually would just be a slap on the wrist. However, due to the outstanding bench warrant his probation officer had issued, Carroll would end up in Springfield, Missouri at the Medical Center for Federal Prisoners. A report filed by Dr. A. E. Miller in August 1980 would state, "There is no evidence of psychosis or neurosis in Mr. Cole. Diagnostically, he may be described as a character disorder. It is unlikely that major personality changes will occur. He does not appear motivated for any sort of treatment at this time." Despite this statement, Carroll would be released on the 4th of October 1980. Carroll would head back to Dallas, where he would murder 3 more victims just in the month of November. He would be 42 years of age, working as a stocker at Toys R Us warehouse. Still on parole from a prior conviction made in California, on the 9th Carroll would meet a woman by the name of Dorothy King in a local bar, strangling her to death in her apartment. On the 11th, he picked up Wanda Faye Roberts at a saloon. Her naked body was discovered the following day on Bryan Street. Witnesses would report that she left with a man by the name of Eddie. A detective by the name of Gerald Robinson was called to examine Wanda's corpse on the 12th of November, 1980, at 6 a.m. Gerald would find that there were bruises on Wanda's neck. Her top had been ripped open to expose her chest and she was naked from the waist down, confirming Gerald's initial suspicions of foul play. Her remains had drag marks and abrasions, indicating she had been hauled across gravel and dirt after she had been killed and stripped. Her pants were found 20 feet away from her body, and she had a driver's license in her pocket that would identify her as Wanda Faye Roberts. Unfortunately though, with the very little information Detective Gerald Robinson had, knowing there were thousands of Eddies around, he had no choice but to wait. Finally, with the 3rd murder that took place in November on the 30th, Carroll attacked Sally Thompson in her apartment. However, unexpectedly, Sally's sons would arrive to find Carroll in Sally's apartment, where she was deceased, face down with some clothing down around her ankles. Carroll would be listed as a suspect in these murders, especially for the 3rd, where he was found on the scene of the crime. Police would arrest him and hold him in custody, but almost released him with the conclusion that the 3rd victim may have passed from natural causes. This was due to there being a possible overdose for the cause of Sally's death and not a homicide. Eddie was detained in a brief detention as a suspicious parolee before his release pending further inquiry. Luckily, Detective Gerald Robinson from Dallas Police that was investigating Wanda Roberts' murder would connect Carroll to the scene from the witness statements of Wanda leaving with an Eddie. There was a file note that would state Carroll's middle name might be shortened to Eddie by friends. With this recent parole status and a couple of phone calls Detective Gerald Robinson had made, he would confirm that Carroll had been staying in a halfway house located within 2 miles of Wanda Roberts' murder scene. After gathering up his findings, including the extensive criminal record Carroll had, Detective Robinson would send his team over to re-arrest Carroll on the 1st of December at the Toys R Us warehouse. Carroll would be interrogated and would finally confess to not only the murder spree he'd done in November, but to a dozen of others he had committed over the years across several states. While this was good news to some extent, as majority of the victims' families would get some sort of justice, Carroll could not provide an exact number or even some names. He would confess that he couldn't remember all of the details exactly due to being drunk when committing these crimes, but gave the police a rough estimate of 14 women over the previous 9 years, from 1971 to 1980, stating he would often target intoxicated women in bars and initially claimed up to 35 victims. With the specifics he could provide, however, he settled on 16 victims in total. This included Essie Buck in San Diego on the 7th of May 1971, Bonnie Sue O'Neill and Diana Paschal, and Marie Cushman in Las Vegas in November 1979. Descriptions that Carroll would provide would match the physical evidence collected, such as where Carroll would dispose of the bodies, ligature marks, which would confirm links to cases that were still unsolved or ruled as accidental, such as Diana Paschal's death that was ruled alcohol poisoning. Thankfully, with the admissions to the high volume of victims, this would spark broader investigations and initiate his eventual extradition to Nevada for the previous crimes. The detectives were then able to link him to a large number of unsolved deaths in Dallas, with witness statements identifying Carroll in the bars or scenes where he would prey on his victims. On top of all of this, his parole record would also incriminate him and would be the nail in his coffin, so to speak, after evading detection for so long. Eddie would cooperate when being interrogated, that it involved coordination with multiple agencies. Everything that Carroll was mentioning would corroborate with forensic details and evidence that were not made available to the public. This would lead to charges in California and Nevada for at least 5 verified killings. It is also important to note that Eddie showed no remorse during his interviews, treating each confession as though it lifted a burden rather than weighed on his conscience. In later interviews, he spoke about his crimes with unsettling calm, even refusing to appeal his death sentence or delay his execution. Although some of his claims about additional victims could never be verified due to lack of evidence, the central confessions matched between 13 and 16 documented murders according to the court records. Eddie would go on to tell police that he was triggered by the behaviours of his victims in respect to their promiscuity and fighting back, which in turn resembled his mother and the way he was treated. He would go on to admit that he performed the occasional necrophilia, manual strangulation, and unsubstantiated cannibalism, claims that could warrant an insanity plea. However, Dallas psychiatrists would examine Carroll's behaviour, noting his very lax demeanour when describing his horrific crimes, which, while very disturbing, he would still be deemed fit for trial. His trial begun on the 6th of April 1981. Carroll would stand before Judge John Meade as a sole defense witness. While under oath, Carroll claimed that years of abuse at the hands of his sadistic and unfaithful mother had fueled a twisted fixation on women he believed had betrayed their husbands or partners. Reflecting on his motives, he told the jury, "I think I've been killing her through them." When questioned about the Dallas murders, Cole admitted that many of the details had become hazy over time. However, he stunned the courtroom by claiming responsibility for 3 additional killings that had never been part of the formal case. These alleged victims included 2 women in San Diego and another woman killed in Oklahoma City during Thanksgiving in 1977. Describing the Oklahoma killing, Cole admitted his memory was fragmented. He could not remember the woman's name, but recalled discovering parts of her dismembered body scattered throughout his apartment. He testified that there had been meat cooking on the stove and more sitting on a plate at the table, suggesting he had consumed part of the victim. The disturbing account left the courtroom in stunned silence. The jury, however, remained unconvinced that these sensational claims supported an insanity defense. Prosecutor Mary Ludwig argued that the cannibalism story was simply another example of Carroll's tendency to exaggerate in an effort to appear mentally unstable. After deliberating for only 25 minutes, the jury found him guilty on 3 counts of murder. The 9th of April 1981, Carroll would be convicted. He was sentenced to life imprisonment at Huntsville Prison. Now this cheeky bugger, barely 2 years inside, in November 1982, he decided he wanted to attempt an escape. He would later write, "By now, escape was my only thought, and I began to put an elaborate plan in effect." In order to do this, Carroll would attempt to make his white prison uniform less conspicuous by dyeing it with food colouring he'd stolen, along with Tabasco sauce for his shoes, to throw off his scent for the tracking dogs. Carroll's plans of being transferred to the prison's garden crew just so he could attempt to overthrow a guard, steal the guard's weapon, and run were all ruined due to an injury Carroll had succumbed to when working in the prison's woodshop. He was transferred to a new facility and forced to disregard his escape plan. Eddie would lay low for a little while after that, and would be informed of his mother's death in January of 1984. A month later, on the 15th of February, Nevada officials formally announced plans to extradite Carroll so he could face capital murder charges. On the 30th of March 1984, Carroll waived his right to contest the extradition, and Las Vegas detectives arrived to take him into custody on the 9th of April. By then, Carroll had abandoned any thoughts of escape, deciding instead that he wanted to face death. Nevada prosecutors were hesitant of the death penalty, and just to be sure that Carroll was in sound mind, has psychiatrists examine him in May 1984, and then again a couple of times in July. All 3 examinations would confirm that Carroll is in fact sane and competent for trial. Eddie had even admitted at one point, and I quote, "I was in my right mind, I knew exactly what I was doing," and would double down on showing no remorse for his actions, declaring, "I know that I would kill again," which would have been very jarring to hear, but cementing in that he strongly believed the death penalty was his only option. On the 16th of August, Carroll appeared before Judge Myron Leavitt and entered guilty pleas to 2 counts of first-degree murder. Despite Carroll's objections, attorney Tom Pitaro was appointed as standby counsel and challenged what he described as Cole's attempt to use the legal system to engineer his own execution. Pitaro argued that Cole had no authority to decide his own punishment, claiming that doing so would compromise the integrity of the court. In the interests of justice, he urged the judge to allow time to investigate any mitigating circumstances that could influence sentencing. This did not faze Carroll, however, and would bluntly state, "I believe in capital punishment. I don't see where Pitaro is going to come up with this stuff, because there's nothing good about me." Carroll's penalty hearing began on the 12th of October 1984 before a 3-judge panel consisting of Judge Myron Leavitt, alongside Judges Richard Legarza and Norman Robinson. During the proceedings, District Attorney Dan Seaton called detectives from Las Vegas, Dallas, Missouri, and Wyoming to testify about Carroll's confessions to multiple murders. Investigators from San Diego also took the stand, but their testimony, marked by confusion over several unrelated cases, added little to the prosecution's case. Carroll himself testified, telling the panel that he believed he could be eligible for parole in Texas within 5 years, a claim that was untrue. He also warned that if parole failed, he had very ample chances of escaping from the Texas Department of Corrections. The judges accepted Carroll's statements at face value and sentenced him to death for the murder of Marie Cushman. However, they could not impose the death penalty for the killing of Kathleen Bloom, because Nevada's capital punishment statute was not in effect at the time of her murder in May 1977. In the end, it made little difference. For Carroll, a single death sentence was all that was needed, and even thanked the judge upon sentencing. Carroll would be transferred to Nevada State Prison in Carson City on the 6th of November 1984. In a striking twist of timing, prison officials announced that the same morning that Nevada's execution chamber closed for the previous 5 years because of gas leaks was finally back in operation. After state lawmakers approved lethal injection in 1983, avoiding the estimated $20,000 cost of repairing the old gas chamber, the transition to the new execution method had at least been completed. If Carroll's sentence was carried out as scheduled, he would become the first inmate in Nevada to be executed by lethal injection. Over the next 11 months, Carroll firmly resisted every effort by outside parties to appeal his death sentence. Those efforts were less extensive than many had anticipated, as even civil liberties advocates were reluctant to champion the cause of a self-confessed serial killer and cannibal. On the 22nd of October 1985, the Nevada Supreme Court upheld Cole's death sentence. 3 weeks later, Judge Myron Leavitt held a hearing and formally set Cole's execution for the 6th of December. Carroll would have just over 3 weeks left to live. In these final weeks, Carroll would complete a handwritten autobiography totaling nearly 100,000 words, continuing to blame his mother, stating, "Anything you do to a kid follows them through life. It's just like a walking time bomb. Carroll would even authorize a Las Vegas neurosurgeon to examine his brain after his execution in the hope that it might provide insight into the origins of his violent behavior. On the 4th of December, he was transferred to a 7-foot by 7-foot last night cell, where he remained under constant suicide watch to ensure he could not deprive the state of carrying out his sentence. The following day, 3 fellow death row inmates filed a last-minute appeal with the Nevada Supreme Court on Carroll's behalf, arguing that he was legally insane. In a rare nighttime session, however, the court swiftly denied the petition. Carroll would order jumbo fried shrimp, French fries, salad with French dressing, and Boston clam chowder for his last meal. He had also requested Kentucky Fried Chicken the night before, but guards could only give him chicken nuggets as he was not allowed to have food with bones. At 1:43 a.m. on the 6th of December, Carroll was escorted into the execution chamber before a small group of selected witnesses. By 2:05 a.m. he had been secured to the execution table with intravenous lines placed in both arms. Warden George Sumner then gave the signal and the lethal injection began as the prescribed chemicals flowed into Carroll's bloodstream. At 2:07 a.m. his body briefly convulsed before becoming still. 3 minutes later, the prison physician officially pronounced him dead. Carroll's brain would be removed several hours after his execution and studied for abnormalities at the University of Nevada, Reno Medical School. Moments after leaving the execution chamber, District Attorney Dan Seaton addressed waiting television cameras, remarking, "It is enjoyable to see the system work."
Why not fight for your life?
I just don't care to.
Are you sorry?
For the victim?
Yes.
Yes.
Are you? Anyone in particular?
Especially the one that was 11 years ago, way back in 1967. And even doing that 5-year sentence, that wasn't enough. But it affected me, just also because I not suffered, but I thought about it and condemned myself for many years. Because I can just imagine what her life might have been like.
Do you deserve to die?
I can't answer that question.
No, it's the ultimate question. It is the question.
For what I did, yes, I think I deserve to die.
Cole's execution is now less than 8 hours away. From the Nevada prison in Carson City, Mark Viero, Eyewitness News 8.
Now, for Spook's 2 cents. Where do I even begin with this one? I guess I will start with the obvious, of how this may have all been prevented had his mother not treated her son so horribly. Witnessing her infidelities the way he did, and the physical, emotional, and mental torment he endured at the hands of his own mother is just not right. Whether or not that could be the case, we will never know, but it definitely fueled a fire in him to act so viciously against women. I would also like to mention how utterly disappointing and disgraceful the whole legal system was up until Carroll's final arrest. The several occasions where he was arrested due to violence or suspicious activity but never really investigated is just mind-blowing to me. He attacked people with a hammer, struggled with alcoholism, and even confessed to police or healthcare professionals on a few different occasions that he had these sick, twisted urges that he couldn't control, and was still released to the general public to continue these crimes. It's just bewildering how no one pieced together that puzzle until it was 16 to 35 murders too late. This is a clear-cut case of the legal system failing women, which it has done in several thousand instances throughout time and all over the world. Had they just kept him locked up, whether it be in prison or a mental health facility, many lives would have been spared. Now the real question. Do I agree with his actions leading up to his death? Absolutely not. He knew he was wired differently in his head and still proceeded to act the way he did and not seek more professional help when he cried out for it on several occasions. There is absolutely no way that I could ever condone his actions. However, I do feel bad for the way he was treated growing up. His mother is supposed to be someone he feels safe and secure with, and he should have experienced a different upbringing. I couldn't find much on his siblings, but I do wonder if they had much the same sort of experience or if their stories are different. What are your thoughts on Carroll, Eddie Cole? Were you expecting the outcome to be lethal injection, or did you think he would find a way to weasel out of facing his consequences? I'm very interested to read what you guys think. Leave a comment to let me know who should be the next Spook Chatter subject. Give me some options in the comments, and maybe they'll be the one I choose. Good evening, guys, ghouls, and girls. Thank you for watching my latest Spook Chatter. Please like and comment on this video, and subscribe to my channel if you enjoy what I do here. If you have a good ghost story that you would like to share with me, or a spooky story you'd like for me to narrate, please feel free to email me. All of my social media links are listed in my link tree, including Red Circle for my podcast, Twitch, where I occasionally stream whatever game I feel like in that moment, Discord server that I run with my friends that are fellow creators, and you can even buy me a coffee. Feel free to connect with me on any of the linked platforms. I really appreciate any and all support.
Stay spooky.